May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts and minds be ever acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. The story of Peter's conversion can ask a lot of its audience. At least when I first hear it, it sounds like this amazing thing happens, and then Jesus says, "Drop everything and follow me." If I were the disciples, I'd be thinking, okay, we might be in a business that struggles on occasion, but we just caught more fish than our boats can carry. Things are looking up for the family business. Maybe we can buy another boat or hire some more crew to increase our chance of catching more fish. But no, you want us to leave everything, business, family, community, and follow you around to what? Teach people about God's kingdom? Don't we have the scribes and the Pharisees for that? And speaking of them, they probably aren't going to be happy with us trying to do their job. And if those doubts aren't enough, it sounds like there's an additional element of guilt for feeling those doubts. After Peter is astounded by the extraordinarily large catch of fish, he responds, "Go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man." So does this mean that we are also sinful or somehow wrong for feeling those doubts that Peter experienced? Well, hopefully these questions and others will be answered as we go along. Most of us aren't going to have to deal with the chaos of the deep and the raging of storms that terrified the ancient mariners. We sail a different form of chaos. But God keeps asking us to cast our nets into deeper water. Reinventing ourselves or pivoting during unexpected times is something that we have had to do quite regularly these past 2 years. As the number of infections ebbs and flows like the tide, we have to change how we function as a church and as a wider community. There are times I find myself very frustrated by this. I feel like I'm just starting to feel comfortable with my routine, and I have to change again, and then again. Recently, I was reminded of this while writing my annual report for vestry. I looked back at the different periods of the past year and how my activities kept changing. At the start of 2021, I was spending a lot of time in the STEP Center, helping Carrie with clients and programming there. I was also helping Martha out with the Christian education for our Super Tuesday programs. As the spring and summer came, things kept changing, whether I was moving from the STEP Center to the church office or shifting between different Christian ed programs. And since the summer, there have also been regular changes with the staff that I see on a regular basis, as Martha and Scott alternatively took different leaves. With the autumn came my ordination and an increase in responsibilities and expectations, and a further round of Christian education programs. Every new program involved learning and preparing new material and meeting new sets of people. The autumn also came with the blessing of a return to in-person worship, which we were able to continue right up until just before Christmas. Then, in the middle of planning for Christmas, we had to shift plans back to digital worship only. And now Scott has moved to work at Renison College. It seems like the changes just keep on coming. And all of these changes require adapting routines. It often feels like I get to the end of the month, I've got a good routine figured out, and then I have to reprogram it. As the changes ebb and flow, I feel a variety of things. Frustration at having to pivot again, excitement at new possibilities, sadness and loneliness when I'm separated from friends and colleagues, Joy when I get to see familiar faces again. Guilt in the early stages of a routine when I haven't figured out how to make it as productive as I would like. Pride and thankfulness when I look back on a cycle and see how God has helped me to find success. And this is just my perspective of these experiences from the past year. I'm guessing that you've all had a variety of changes or pivots that you've had to deal with, and that these have been experienced with a variety of feelings. So what do we do with Jesus' instruction to cast our nets into deeper waters? And with that expression of guilt that we hear from Peter. When we look a bit closer at the calling of St. Peter, in Luke's Gospel, we will see there is not a moral judgment of Peter. That expressing doubt, looking for reasonable choices, are part of discerning vocation. And although Jesus is asking Peter and the others to do something new, there's also something familiar about what Jesus is asking. Go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man. Peter is probably just feeling the weight of human life. In this circumstance, sinful is not a moral term, but it simply means outside the divine, outside that which is holy. It's not some sort of moral failing on Peter's part. It's just acknowledging that he is limited. If it was a moral failing, Jesus would have pronounced some form of absolution or forgiveness. Just as in the Isaiah reading we heard, the seraph touched the coal to Isaiah's mouth to purge him of his sin. And in other examples of Luke, Jesus forgives the sins of many. So in this circumstance, it's not a moral failing of Peter. Rather, Jesus just invites Peter to drop his fear. Jesus responds with the invitation, do not be afraid. It's an acknowledgement that although we are finite human beings with all kinds of limitations, we can and we are called by God to fulfill our vocations. We are called by God. Along with this acknowledgement of our humanity and our limitations, there's that element of the familiar that I mentioned earlier. Although Jesus is calling Peter to something new, he's calling him to apply what is familiar to this new ministry and service to God's people. Jesus asks Peter and the others to be fishers of people. Fishing is what they know, and Jesus wants them to connect this experience to the new ministry that he is asking them to take on. Now, I haven't done much fishing in my life, so I apologize to those who have more experience with it than myself. But from what I know about fishing, I can imagine how Jesus' request has some elements familiar to Peter. Fishing can involve long periods of waiting for the fish to fill the nets, waiting for them to bite that baited hook. Fishing also involves some knowledge of what you are trying to catch, knowing when the fish are active, what type of water they like, what type of food works good for bait, how big they are so you use the right test line or the right size of net. Fishing also involves enduring various weather conditions, from the raging storms to windless hours that leave ships becalmed. Most of these are experiences that Peter could relate to, and they all have parallels in ministering to people. Jesus' vision of ministry involves long periods of waiting for people to understand his message, waiting for people to start following, waiting for change. And just as fishing involves understanding the fish, Jesus' vision of ministry involves knowing the people, knowing their needs, their strengths, their concerns, and their hopes for the future. Jesus also wanted his disciples to understand that ministry would involve enduring many different social conditions, from sunny moments of popularity to raging crowds full of resentment, anger, and desperation. In my own experience with change over the past year, some things have remained consistent and familiar. People looking for connection, whether it's in the Step Center or the Super Tuesday program, one thing that has been consistent is people desiring to maintain meaningful relationships. Another familiarity is that there's been a lot to learn. Whether writing sermons, preparing Christian Ed for Super Tuesday, helping with the technology. All of these things have involved learning new material, solving problems, and above all, approaching each new challenge with the attitude of, okay, now this. Let's get to it and make it as good as possible. And I thank God for showing me that although the challenges are consistent, so too is the solution of keeping an open mind, even if that attitude isn't easy to find at first. This is the vocation that Jesus is calling Simon Peter to, and it's a story that is also common in the Gospels of Matthew and Mark. But personally, I like today's version from Luke. I find it a bit more comforting. In Matthew and Mark, the calling of the first disciples takes place earlier in Jesus' ministry, just after the stories of baptism and temptation. In Luke, these disciples are not called until after they have witnessed Jesus in action. There are earlier stories in Luke where Simon and the others witness Jesus before Jesus calls them to follow him. Luke allows his readers to identify with the disciples as they gradually gather information and form an impression of who Jesus is. I like the description of theology as faith seeking understanding, and I'm uncomfortable with taking blind leaps. So this version of calling in Luke is something I find more comfortable. Perhaps it comes out of Luke's own vocational experience as a physician. At least, I tend to think of doctors as individuals who spend a good deal of effort and reason in diagnosing their patients before offering a treatment. So whether it's the gradual call to vocation, the acknowledgement of our limitations and frustrations, or the knowledge that there will be something familiar, even amidst great change and upheaval, I feel that there are parts of this story that can provide comfort as we continue to answer God's call to cast our nets into deeper waters. So may you find the comfort amidst upheaval, the familiar amidst change, and the grace to know that you are human, even while you are experiencing God's call in your life. Amen.